the New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.
Greetings and welcome along to the New Zealand Tech Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Spain, and today joined by Frances Valintine. Welcome, Frances. How are you?
Good. Kia ora, Paul. Great to see you.
Likewise. It's nice to be able to sit down and have a bit of a chat.
In the real world.
Face to face.
Yeah, it's so good.
Maybe you can just a little bit of an introduction to those that don't know you, where you fit into this world of technology and education.
Sure.
And then we'll jump in from there.
Okay, so this is 25 years for me have been in education and technology. It's sort of a bit of a segue, well, it's sort of almost a collision, I guess, of two fields that I love. Technology, I kicked in around the late 80s, early 90s when the tech world was really coming to its own. I was based in London. And then education, I got the bug coming back into Aotearoa a few years later when I realised there was this whole new industries that were starting to emerge and nobody was training for them. And so I decided at that point it was really good to get involved with the creative sector, the creative technologies, with a bit of e-commerce thrown in for good measure in the early 90s and into the 2000s. And these days I am the founder and the CEO of the Mind Lab and Tech Futures Lab here in Tamaki Makaurau.
Fantastic. Well, I know there's a whole lot more to that story, and you have so much, recognition for your expertise as an education futurist, and lots and lots of awards. So it's a real privilege to get some time to share with you today. Keen to hear about your new book, but first of all, we'll jump into some of the happenings in the tech world.
Absolutely.
And let's have a little bit of a chat around where things are going. On the New Zealand front, we see New Zealanders playing this role in potentially shaping something of the future of the metaverse, this new Web 3.0 world, the world of distributed technology, NFTs, and we've had South by Southwest happening in the US and in Texas. And I was looking at some coverage from Fortune magazine, and they have their title was "Open or Closed: A Key Battle Over the Metaverse is Underway that will decide this buzzy technology's future," which was kind of a fun title. But they've sort of delved into, I guess, Mark Zuckerberg and Meta / Facebook wanting to get in and to play a very important role in the future of technology. But also they quite quickly delved into a quote from Brooke Howard-Smith, Non-Fungible Labs and the Fluff World with their NFTs. And really, he was just talking about this ability to take these NFTs and things that maybe are in one world and being able to move them around between other worlds, and that's where this weekend Non-Fungible Labs and the varying other partners there have been pushing this concept of a metaverse manifesto and looking to create this interoperability piece. Now, from where you sit...
I guess, I think that what's amazing right now is just the number of people I'm sure sitting here listening going, hang on, back up the track a little bit, we're still back at the metaverse. And I think this is the challenge we have, is it's so many things to different individuals. For me, within the world of education and connection and networks, I just love this idea that we're going to have these environments which are, the sort of where the virtual world meets the real world, and takes us from this constant looking at each other on Zoom like a bunch of Muppets sitting there at the beginning of the show to this idea that you would be able to share these spaces and trade in these spaces. And I think that this is where businesses who are not really having their eye on the ball about what it looks like for them. Like, what does their physical business or their virtual business look like in the metaverse? And, I think what's going to be interesting is if you look at the moment, the acquisition of property in the metaverse, and, do you buy down the street from Snoop Dogg, or do you kind of wait to see who the next cool location is? And is your brand, better suited to sit alongside some other great brands in the metaverse, or should you be starting your own sort of virtual world and trading and using your NFTs or whatever form of digital currency you choose? So I think we're at the stage where we don't know who's going to win the race. There's certainly lots of big brands spending hundreds of thousands of dollars acquiring their premises and building these virtual facilities and malls and shops and houses. And, I think it's fascinating, but I can see with the likes of even the technologies around VR, AR, and even Google Glasses coming out with 2.0. Dare we even mention Google Glasses? I'm not sure. But but the idea is where everybody's fighting to figure out who's going to sit at the table in these new spaces and who gets to trade and actually what does that look like?
Yeah, and look, there's so much still to figure out, and we can take in all sorts of information, but actually, predicting the future, well, that's there's that opportunity really for each of us to participate in defining what that future looks like, right? Because it's yet to be written.
Yeah, and I think the great thing about these major leaps in technology is it's democratized in the beginning because nobody knows who's going to win. It's a bit like the early days of Bitcoin. Those who got in early and took the punt, who won, I guess, in the early stage if they hung on to them. And then you have those who come in later who don't do quite so well. But actually, in the end, it's everybody's able to get in when they want to. And so the early adopters, I think, like most technologies, will always be the winners. But they'll also be part of the first wave, and there'll be a second and a third wave, and things will change and merge and morph. And the technology companies who dominate right now, my view is unless they're almost reinventing themselves, they're going to be replaced by new emerging technologies who are even smarter and better at these new sort of virtual worlds. Clearly Meta with Facebook are trying to be domineering and kind of own that space. But then you look at every other tech giant and they're saying the same thing. So, who gets to win and who gets to play is yet to be determined. But I think it's certainly an area where every large company in the world should be spending a considerable amount of time just to understand the nuances of why is this coming, who will be playing, and actually what is the demographic of the people who are going to spend a lot of time and money, virtual money, in this new world.
Yeah, and it's quite a challenge, I think, because the pockets of knowledge often, and probably the bigger the business is, then the more of a challenge that often becomes in terms of, well, who's got the knowledge? Are they in a position to redirect a business? Should a business be sort of redirecting its thinking? How and where do you invest? Do you throw money at something and look silly? Or do you not throw money at something and look
slow.
silly and slow? Yeah. But even for those that get involved, really early, and a few years ago I had the privilege of visiting Rochester, New York, which was the home of, still is the home of Kodak and Xerox, and I sat down with the inventor of the digital camera, and Kodak were right there. They spent the money. They invented the
and then they held on to it and didn't let it play.
And they messed it up. So it's a lot of things have to kind of happen right. For organisations to really secure their long-term futures as the world changes, don't they?
One of the things that most people don't really focus on enough is the demographic change in the world. That we often talk about the age of people are living much longer, but what we miss is Generation Z is enormous. They're the biggest population in the world right now, and they're fully digital. So, and they they love playing in this new space. They like thinking about the new technologies that inform them and the places they like to hang out. And so if you're sitting there as a professional service firm and you're assuming that everybody's going to come walking through your door and sit at your table and pay for your consultancy fees, in 5 years' time, I mean, you'd be very misinformed. You're going to have another generation who are already in the workforce and starting to become quite dominant in the workforce, who are saying, well, let's meet in a virtual space. Let us trade, let us do business, let us exchange value in a very different way. And so this idea of value exchange will also be on the table about it's not money for hours. And we're seeing that in the future of work already, where people are working very differently. And the idea that you work 9 to 5 feels a bit foreign now, even after just 2 years of that big disruption and circuit breaker of COVID. So I do think that you will see the new professional service firm will be a brand new one. It won't be the big four that we know. It'll be someone else who comes in and says, we operate in an entirely different way, and we are serving a new group of underserved people who will be those under 40, particularly those under 30 who are coming through, and they'll say, we'll trade the way you want to work, and we'll work the way you want to work in whatever time zone you want to be, in whatever location that you want to work. And I think we're seeing now, even myself, more people saying, hey, I want to keep working with you and working for the organisation, but do you mind if I do that from Bali? And, I think that we're kind of in this very fluid time about how people want to work, and I think more and more of it will happen in this virtual space where we don't coexist in the same way. And once you move into a distributed workforce, then moving it online into a virtual, into a metaverse is just kind of one next step. So much easier to do.
Yeah, it's a really exciting time, and I think we look at COVID and how it's impacted things, and it really has helped to change the thinking, because something that otherwise would have taken a lot longer in terms of change in work habits has really been pushed forward.
Yeah, I think that the benefit, if there's a silver lining from COVID, is it enabled people to think about things differently, and actually there wasn't time to test things out and say, well, what happens if we work from home, and how do we move into sharing platforms and collaborative tools, and how are we on different productivity measures and metrics. It was through necessity. And so once people tried that, it was really it was almost by stealth that we did things. And then the surprise aspect was, hey, actually a lot more productivity happened in many cases, and actually people adopted technologies would have taken years to go through and adopt, and businesses actually had to kind of supersede investment into new types of platforms, and then some had to break the rules completely and say, okay, we are going to allow people to work with confidential information through new systems and VPNs and doing different things. So I think there is no way that the world would have advanced in the way it has, and I think while there are two sides to every ledger, a lot more people today have the flexibility they've always desired, and are probably looking at a much more flexible future in their workforce and their careers, and that can really only be attributed to COVID and the actual necessity of pulling off the Band-Aid and looking at things differently.
Yeah. It's exciting. Now, just looking at some other areas where New Zealand's pushing forward, electric ferries. Now, we look at our electric vehicles, and the growth has really been accelerating, on that front, here and globally. And I think with the price of oil, that's probably helped a lot of people to maybe reevaluate the equations. Here in New Zealand, of course, there's been a subsidy for those buying electric vehicles. I think that subsidy drops next month. So
the end of March, I think it is.
But not too much. So I think we're going to see, a continued movement on that front, and until the internal combustion engine vehicle is sort of a rare thing on the roads. I mean, these things take quite some time to happen, and it's not as though cars are replaced quite as quickly as we do our smartphones and other gadgets. Certainly within New Zealand, I guess some markets like Japan, where they don't keep their cars very long at all, they probably will transition faster. But yeah, the electric theory in Wellington, Wellington Electric Boat Building Company have got their new one operating and has done its maiden public sailing, which is pretty exciting.
Oh, look, it can't happen fast enough. And I think, I've went over to the Netherlands a few years ago before COVID and did a smart city tour with the government there and the amount of electrification there between buses and trams and boats and autonomous boats that are electric, the trains and the buses run, and then there's also electric planes. So I think we really need to think about it. I have to say I'm thrilled. I drive an electric car and I wouldn't give it up for anything. And actually, what's fascinating for me is when I talk to my graduate students, almost everyone admits if they had the ability, their next purchase for a car would be electric. And I think to your point, with the cost of petrol going up and petrol costs almost never come down, I think it's going to be probably the catalyst that really changes things if people can afford to. I appreciate there's lots of other considerations around sustainability and what do we do with all these old petrol cars. But I think long term, it's going to be better for the environment. We just probably have to solve the issue around the batteries, in terms of some of the fossil fuels and things we need for the batteries. But once I changed a couple of years back to an electric car, it's certainly no going back.
Yeah, I'd agree on that front. And look, there's all sorts of options. Our family bought an electric sort of moped, the modern equivalent of a Vespa.
Awesome.
It's very, very cool. Certainly the EVs have been coming down in price. In fact, I looked over the weekend at the price of the Tesla Model 3, the base model, which is subsidised at the moment, and compared it to the US price. It's actually cheaper to buy in New Zealand right now than it is to buy in the US. So those that have been sitting on the fence and wondering whether to buy, probably the price is going to go up. If I had to,
I'd say so.
If I had to make a prediction on that front. 5 to 7 months is the delivery wait at the moment. So,
actually, I do have a Tesla, and I got it 2.5 years ago, and I had a 3.5 year wait from the time I put the deposit down.
Yeah, similar boat.
And but I have to say, I've also got my deposit down on the Cybertruck for no other reason than I just driving a Pixel around sounds kind of like the next crazy Mad Max world. But I think the reality is you're right. The demand for electric cars, I think, will go through the roof. As I watched on Friday evening, passing 3 petrol stations on the way home with queues, spilling down the road of people waiting to get petrol, reminiscent of going back decades ago where where petrol prices were sort of going up dramatically. And I think people will start to do the math and start to think about, actually, by the time you do the equation and the subsidies, and if that continues in some form, it's a pretty good time to think about it.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned this on the podcast maybe last week or the week before, but for those that are in a position to do so, you can pre-buy fuel from Z using the Z Share Tank app. So a friend that bought a Tesla after last week also messaged me, and because he's got a big weight, said thank you for the advice, and he sent me a screenshot. He just bought 550 litres of fuel with Z at the current price.
So you can hedge it at the current price. I think that's a great advice, and I think one that more people should know about.
Yeah, so rather handy. Now, looking forwards, we have this incredible infrastructure in New Zealand when it comes to connectivity, especially with fibre. Chorus sent through a press release this morning talking about the phase out of copper. So they're just now, really at that stage where there are, some areas where people have moved to fibre entirely or very close to it, and they're now, talking through this withdrawal of copper. Which I think just something that consumers need to be aware of. There has been some messaging coming out from telcos that's trying to nudge people towards fixed wireless services over the mobile networks, and in my view, some of those communications have been very much sort of self-serving from the telco's perspective to move to their mobile network because of the lower costs, and it's not always the right thing to do. So if family members who will just do whatever they're told by their telco, might be a chance to have a word to them if you haven't already. Probably most of these comms are out now already, but I keep hearing about people sort of putting their hands up and are asking for help or are saying, oh, this happened, and we were kind of told that copper was going. Well, it is, but over quite a long period, and copper is not being removed where there isn't fibre. So
right,
I think that's probably the thing to be aware of. And one of the cases I was alerted to recently was somebody out in a rural location where it was, their telco was moving them from copper to a fixed wireless service, and actually their speed was going to degrade with that particular change. Now, hopefully that's an exception to the rule, because look, there certainly are cases where it absolutely makes sense to go to fixed wireless service. My father's in a retirement home, and he's just gone through that change, and I think after he got onto his third router, a couple of visits to the local Vodafone store, he's eventually got something that works and is operating. And for his internet usage, absolutely, that's probably the right thing to do. But not every case will be like that.
Yeah, and I think it's a point. I mean, I had up until last year a property in Waitakere in West Auckland, and it's only 35 kilometres from the city, but I couldn't get mobile there at all, and I could only get basic, VDSL at best for internet. One of the reasons that I'm not there anymore. But if they'd taken it away then, the connection put me onto mobile, I would have had no coverage at all, and there was no intention of putting coverage in that valley. So I'm not sure how those sorts of pockets, even within cities, would cope. Interesting enough, at home, and this sounds a bit of a plug for another Elon product, but I have Starlink, and that's partially as a backup. I spend all day in my business running online. I spend a lot of that time from home. Yeah. So I have fibre and Starlink, and I think we will see more and more technologies which are satellite based, and we'll start to see external parties, and it will get more and more competitive. And so I think you and I, we spend all our time in technology and seeing where things are going. We need to test them and I see some real benefits from having a more competitive market than just the big telcos.
Yeah, look, it's really interesting to have spent time trying out Starlink and to see, wow, most of the time it's pretty good. It will have its glitches and so on, but it puts some good pressure on our telcos. I guess I like to see as much as possible happening locally, so the money's going back into our economy. But there's not likely to be any kind of local equivalent to Starlink anytime soon. There will be some competition for Starlink as the other players come through with their offerings in the market, but. We have a very interesting, time ahead in terms of telecommunications, and New Zealand is one of the best places to live, in the world because of what great infrastructure we've got, and that Starlink is here reasonably early compared to some other places, and so really it doesn't matter where you are in the country. You've got some pretty good options probably right now. And by the end of what we see, there's still a little bit more to go on the next stage or the current stage of the fibre rollout and rural broadband. Just gets better. So it's great.
And actually, just going back to Starlink, I have a staff member, for example, who couldn't get anything more than really a dial-up speed out south, and it was a no-brainer for us as a company to say, okay, get Starlink and get that installed. And her life changed, her kids' life changed. When she went to lockdown, we had to figure out a solution because she couldn't come to the city, and it enabled her and her children to learn remotely. And it was a game changer for them in a time when there wasn't an alternative. And like if there wasn't an option locally, I'd certainly take it. But it's always about directionally where things are going and making sure we look at the options. And hopefully businesses will come in behind and say, hey, there's a real market opportunity.
Yeah. It is interesting that I think it's Japan where Starlink has they've got a local partnership there rather than selling direct, but I'm not aware of that happening sort of anywhere else in the world. But as we've seen with Tesla, there's some real upsides to a direct business model. There's probably some downsides too in terms of local throats to choke, as they as they say. But in general, I think this is the nature of the way tech is changing the world, and so we see various parts of the supply chain and distribution chain sort of evaporate. And,
I think what I like about when you've got those, whether they're local or global, who are really leading from the edge, it gives a direction for others to follow. We need to know what shining stars we're chasing in terms of democratising access, and internet access needs to be for everyone. It can't just be for those who can afford it. And everything I see in tech always starts with the very wealthy in the beginning, and then the trickle down effect. The first Tesla that came out were well outside the average person's price range, and in fact the first two. And it wasn't really till they got to the Model 3 that actually more people could start to see that it was comparable to a new car, a petrol car. And I think we'll see the same thing with access to other forms of energy, and solar will be another one. As we start to think about electric vehicles and even cycles, all those things will start to change, and I think a lot of it's going to come back to internet connectivity as it becomes more accessible for all. And I keep thinking, it wasn't that long ago, I lived rurally, and I was using a local service, and I got 8 gigabytes a month for a family of 4. And it was it was hundreds of dollars per month, and we literally watched every single download, and it was like a day by day, just trying to make sure we didn't tip over, because the cost if we went over was just so prohibitive. So it wasn't, maybe it was 14 years ago, but it was just extraordinary.
Yeah, things just change so quickly. Now, we'd like to talk about, from time to time, this future vision of autonomous vehicles and self-driving cars. So it did catch my attention over the weekend, seeing that in the US, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration are opening the door to this next phase of vehicles that will operate, without the sort of manual controls like a steering wheel and so on.
Great.
That we're used to. So these things are starting to come through, and basically new rules coming into play for this world of autonomous vehicles, which is I think pretty exciting to see it progressing, and we don't really have time to sort of delve too much into all the realities of that, but also Japan either has now introduced or it's going through the process with the government there, new legislation that sets a framework for fully autonomous cars on the roads in Japan as well. And of course, there are lots of other markets where there have been, varying bits and pieces of legislation or moves forward. But, we look at Japan and the US are pretty influential when it comes to
I think the other place,
vehicles, and China, which are moving forward pretty quickly on autonomous, right?
Although I think the one that's probably most advanced right now is Dubai with their autonomous taxi fleet, which they're rolling out right now. And by the end of the year, they expect, I think it's half the taxis within Dubai to be autonomous, and that is again without sort of level 3, level 4, without the steering wheel, without having sort of the dummy person in the front seat holding fort. So I think there are some definite markets right now where they're seeing the benefits. And again, if the price of petrol keeps going up, having access to mobility is going to be more important than having mobility yourself. And that's where having the benefit of autonomous vehicles coming to your house, picking you up and keep moving, and so that potentially less cars on the road. It's going to take a while to get to that benefit. But I think it's a good time for these indicators of change that we're seeing around the world are being spurred by some of the world events that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, it's really exciting times. And Apple made their big announcements last week that were somewhat available up front. There's always a little bit of leakage, shall we say, when it comes to Apple announcements. But their M1 chips that they've been slowly rolling out across their devices just seem to be getting more and more powerful. So, pretty interesting to see this M1 Max chip, which is their top fastest chip, and I've seen it referenced as basically the fastest computer chip available. There are obviously varying ways you can measure that and view that. The new Macs are looking pretty slick and pretty fast. And even the new iPhone announcement, which is their SE, which is their lowest cost phone. I like the way that Apple releases those phones, and that it's the most affordable iPhone, but it's not using 1, 2, 3, 4 5-year-old technology. It's actually got the same
latest,
chip in it as their iPhone 13. So in terms of those that are looking across their organisation, and I know we have these discussions within my own clients and organisations of, well, what's the most secure phone? And in some organisations, there's very much the feeling that going with the Apple product and the pace at which the updates, security updates, and so on come through, creates this desire to give people an iPhone, but there's been a real premium. So this makes that more accessible if a workforce wants to push those out.
And I think it's the same if we're just talking about with Teslas. I mean, Apple is smart. The world population is growing. It's growing at the bottom end in terms of age. It's new emerging markets, places like Africa and the Middle East, and they need a product to get into market for market share. And to your point, using the latest technology is definitely the way to go. They want to showcase the best. They want to take on their market share in that way. And, I imagine chip makers like Intel right now are sitting back saying, what did we miss? How is it that we were, the golden child for so long, and then suddenly out of nowhere, basically the supply chain got reversed and they're creating their own chips. And I think we'll see more of this as people in large tech companies start to realise that if they can have the market share in all parts of the market, but if we can make it more affordable, more accessible and more equitable, then actually they're going to be better for it, because pricing and just the constant replacement of phones is not a behaviour we're seeing in Gen Z. They don't want the throwaway economy. They don't want to keep replacing. They want to be able to fix and maintain and keep technology for longer. That's the benefit of software.
Yeah.
So, I think they've probably been playing a smart game, and hopefully others will follow and actually make it so that we have great technology that lasts longer, and actually the benefit is the software that we get, the upgrades, and not so much looking at the hardware changes.
Yeah, and when I look at companies like Apple and Tesla, and there are so many others, and I guess they're examples where it's really obvious. We see that futurist thinking just goes back over a long period of time. For Apple to be in this position that they are today, I don't know how many years it goes back. When they certainly, they acquired a chip company, and they've done all these things over. It's a long period for Tesla to be where Tesla are today.
Absolutely.
A lot of futurist thinking over a long period of time, and it's really essential that we have that thinking inside our organisations, and that we continue to have that futurist focus, which probably brings us to talking about what's happening in your world, Frances.
And and I think it's interesting. People often talk about things like AR and VR and 3D printing, and even like companies like Netflix. They've all been around for more than 25 years. These are not just overnight successes, and it's by the time that the consumer first experiences some of these things, they feel like it's where did this come from? I remember when Pokemon Go came out a few years ago, and people were like, wow, AR, this new technology. And I was thinking back to the University of Canterbury back in the late 90s, when they had the Human Interface Technology Laboratory, or HITLab, doing AR way back then, running off $1 million computer. What changes is the cost of processing changes, and the cost of storage changes. And for me in my career, it's always been looking at the types of technologies and software and behaviours that change the way we think about work and jobs. And so, which led me to this intersection between technology and education. And right now I'm seeing that it's speeding up at a rate that's just quite extraordinary. We talk about exponential and Moore's law and the law of accelerating return, but actually right now we can see it. Things are shifting so rapidly. So we have a bunch of people who are in their mid-career, mid-tier managers, executives, board members, who, if they haven't got their eye really closely on the ground and listening really closely to good advice, they could miss entirely big shifts of change, and their competitors are going to have a huge advantage over what they're doing. And it's a bit of a watch-out time for a lot of people.
Yeah, and really every sector is impacted, isn't it? And I think there's that, often that sort of assumption. You sort of look at, well, that's okay there with taxis and Uber or, what have you. But, we probably aren't always very good at picking that, our own fields are going to be impacted in all sorts of ways, and we've got to be putting on that futurist hat. And as I like to say, we all need to be futurists. We all have to have that futurist mindset and be looking out, further than probably what we ever have done in the past. Anyway, on to your book, which was launched last week. What can you tell us?
So, Future You. Not surprising, the title, I guess, a book written basically for professionals who are looking into the future saying, how much of this do I really need to know? Do I really have to reskill? Can't I leave this for someone else to do? And also using just, lots of case studies or situations where I've looked at, I've taught over the years, well over, 10, 15,000 students who are all adults. So the average age of our students right now is 42. And also on platforms where I've taught tens of thousands of adults. And, the characteristics of those who lean into change and the characteristics of those who are really quite intimidated by them can be quite profound and actually career damaging if people are just sort of like, I can trade on what I know because actually it served me well. And I think Future You was written with this idea that we can all be anyone we want to be. There isn't an age where you can't learn. The only thing that stops people learning and advancing and getting comprehension of new changes is a mindset and time. And I do find it fascinating that a lot of people destruct their own potential because they get to a certain age and say, oh look, I can't do that, I'm too old. Or somebody in their mid-40s said, oh, my kids will set things up on the computer and I don't really understand, and my work have changed some of the software, so I'm not very happy about it. And actually, if they leant into it and actually embraced it, their career has so much more potential. The other part of Future You is we're living longer. We 3 scores plus 10, which was the old saying around we'd live to be 70. Not many people die at 70 these days. In fact, it's really only those with underlying conditions. Most of us would expect to live well into our 90s, and that would be statistically backed up. And of course, our children will live even longer. So this idea that our careers will finish at 65 if we live to be closer to 100, what do we do for those 35 years if we haven't stayed able to be able to adapt and adopt new technologies? And so that's one big challenge I focus on. But the other one is what happens between, say, 45 and 65 if you haven't kept up to date and you lose your job? If you're 50 and suddenly you found yourself made redundant, what job can you apply for that's going to give you the benefit of the experience and you're advancing your older years, to carry on? And I think there's going to be a lot more people in their 50s find themselves unemployable. And I think it's a very harsh reality that people have to understand that today when you're hiring for the skills you need today. And if you took a typical person and said, find your job on a job board in Silicon Valley and tell me if you could do the same job, same title, read the description, tell me if you could do what they're asking you to do, almost no one says, oh yeah, I could do that. The face, the drain colour of their face, they look at it and say, I literally don't even understand what they're asking or the software they're saying are required, or the terminology or the language. It's pretty confronting. And we're only just behind that. Give us 2 or 3 years, those same jobs are going to be, the jobs that we see here. And, people will actually, if they don't keep ahead of those changes, will find it very difficult to step into those jobs.
Yeah, and there's a broader impact, isn't there? Because if, as individuals, we don't start making these changes in our mindset in terms of how we educate ourselves and keep ourselves up to date, then there's a much bigger flow on to, the success of our own, families and, ultimately as a nation, our success. If we push ourselves ahead and we all put on that futurist, that hat and we're looking forward to making those decisions, and that has a tremendous, flow on for New Zealand. But at the other end, if we don't get that, we don't bring those changes about, then the challenges that we have as a nation, as a society, and in all sorts of different areas, then we're going to get stuck with those same problems getting bigger rather than us moving ahead, which is where we want to be, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think the understanding that the knowledge economy is where directionally we need to be heading. We need to be trading a lot more in our knowledge and expertise. And forgive me, but you and I we're not spring chickens. And I'm sure you get this as well, and people say to me, but how do you know all this stuff? How does this conversation, and it's sort of almost like some osmosis that we just walk through knowledge and it just sort of lands in our brains. You keep active, you keep reading, you pick up authentic, reliable source of information, you have really great discussions with friends and networks. It's those things that keep us informed. It's not about just hiding from those conversations. And I do think it's a big difference of that's sort of the ultimate dinner party when you've got a whole bunch of people who've got a vast array of different knowledge and you can sort of share and bounce off each other, versus people who haven't had that and they've got they talk about the kids' sport and the weather last weekend and when are we going to go to the Pauanui again. I think we have to surround ourselves with people who don't just think like us and who can inject new topics into a conversation where you go, whoa, what are you talking about? What is that thing you just talked? I've never heard of that before. And so for me, that's where life gets interesting, as you get people who are reading or sharing ideas and listening to great podcasts and saying, okay, there's a few things in that podcast which I'm going to write down and I'm going to research, and then I'm going to have a conversation with my team or my kids and actually start to understand that better. And so going back to the book, that's really what it's about. It's saying, this is something that we can all do. And for part of it, for me, it was saying yes to every opportunity I could. And I started that at the age of 35. I just decided what was there to lose. If people asked me to do something, even if it was terrifying and I didn't understand it, I'd just say yes. And actually going forward, it's really served me well. And by the time I hit 50 last year, it was sort of like, hey, actually this, I feel like I'm just starting this escalation of like so much exciting things ahead of me and ahead of my children's world as well that I want to be part of. And really, I see that the more you embed yourself in this environment of just great topics and really interesting things that are happening in the world, the more doors open and the more conversations that happen. And it kind of has this really amplifying effect that you get to be involved with more great conversations, and the world just kind of opens right across up. Everything opens up.
Yeah. Oh, that's this is a great discussion. Tell us a little bit about the Mind Lab and Tech Futures Lab. Obviously, encourage everyone to go out and get the book, however you can. Is there an audio book version?
Not yet, but there is a Kindle version, and there's I don't even know how audiobooks. So HarperCollins are my publishers, and I'm not sure how that works, but it is available, in all good bookstores.
Yep. Audiobooks NZ, they're friends of ours.
Oh, good,
so,
good. I'll have to talk to them.
Talk to Theo. But yeah, I'm keen to understand a little bit. You mentioned before around sort of the average age of those going through your programs. Was it 42?
42, yeah.
Which is really, really encouraging.
Yeah, so I have every year around 1,400 postgraduate students. We only teach at postgraduate level, so everybody's coming in with a bit of history behind them. And then we'd also have online learning as well, and one platform in particular called Digital Boost, which has 45,000 business owners who are learning to digitise through their support through MB, who are sponsoring that platform. But the main students coming through are mid-career, and one of four things have typically happened. It's either they've had a really great job opportunity passed by them and someone else has been promoted above them, and they've been suddenly like, how did that happen? Or they've been made redundant from their job, or they've lost a really important family member, and often it's a parent, or they've suddenly sat down and looked at their kids and realised their kids are experiencing a world they don't really understand. So one of those catalysts is often the kind of the moment in time where our students come in and go, you know what, it's time for me to get back into learning and actually understand, where things are going. And it's a real privilege to teach adults. They're all part-time, so they're all pretty much employed. And the My Lab and Tech Futures Lab are both organisations that are basically sort of sister organisations, and we've been in, really sort of dominantly playing in that postgraduate professional development space for the last nearly 9 years. And in fact, just last week when the book came out, it was also the same week that we had a 50% investment of shareholding into the business from a fund called the Equity Impact Fund out of Sydney. So a big week last week. So
congratulations.
Yeah, and look, it's a really lovely next step for a fund that recognises impact and sustainability, but also about what is needed in the world of education. And so for this particular Sydney-based fund, it's the first time that they have invested in a New Zealand organisation, and certainly the first time in professional development or higher education. So sort of for them, it's a step into a new direction. But what's happened with COVID is the amount of adults who are learning right now globally has just soared. It's just surged ahead. It's just suddenly all these online platforms, we've taken some of the best institutes in the world, have opened their doors online and allowed students to come in. So it's not that geographic, you have to be somewhere. And what's happened is we've watched our children learn online, adults have started getting on board, and I really think that this is the generation where we're going to see a lot more people saying, lifelong learning. We've heard the phrase for a long time. This is actually going to be the reality of lifelong learning, that people will keep investing every few years. It might be a sabbatical, it might be alongside their work, it might be a deal they do with their boss to have a few hours off every week. But I do think we're starting to understand that knowledge is not for life. Actually, it needs to be replaced. It's like, I actually even refer in my book about being a bit like a phone. The day you get your phone, it's a depreciating asset if they don't get new software, if you're not getting new apps. And so when you hire a person, the day you hire them, they are a self-depreciating asset if they're not learning. So they're actually going backwards.
Yeah.
So you need to be investing in people from the day that they start working for you. And then actually, they can work for you as long, and they can be there 10, 20 years if they keep learning. But if they're sort of like, okay, everything I ever needed to learn I already know, then you probably don't want to hold on to them forever because actually you're not going to get that real value.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's exciting. And are you seeing or are you open to international students? Is there a future that's a little bit more than just New Zealand?
Yeah, so one of the things we did change during COVID is we went through the whole accreditation process again for international students. So we haven't started as of yet, but that is definitely on once borders open. But we can also now teach all of our programs fully online. So all our master's programs can be taught fully online. And we've got flagship programs like the Master of Technological Futures, which is kind of a catch-all for all the things we've talked about today for people who want to understand the future. And they could be from an agri background, they could be from a logistics background, and they could be from almost any background. It's this idea of where are the technologies of the future going to take us. And I do think, one of the things you were talking before around it's all sectors. I was thinking about logistics. Within the country, normally delivery is either free or it might be $5. That is a huge cost for a business. The last mile delivery in this country is unbelievably expensive. And so it's a hit for every time they do that delivery. People don't want you to deliver to you, they want you to come and pick up. But actually, the one company who comes in and figures that one out and actually can figure out how you get last mile delivery to a consumer quickly, then they are going to dominate that market. And it could be the Costco who's coming into New Zealand, or the IKEA, or it could be a completely new entrant who just takes on that role. But I know within every vertical there are challenges that people are trying to solve, and technology, it already exists to solve those problems. It's just a matter of when and how to implement those changes.
Yeah, and we want to see Kiwis having those ideas and the ability to execute them. So, as much as we can, it's
Absolutely.
not the offshore player that's coming in and just disrupting all of our local entities. Much better if we're coming up with those things, and our local businesses are able to do well and to thrive with global competition. and even better to be taking and exporting some of these innovations and technologies globally, like we've seen in so many fields, and we just need more of that, don't we?
Yeah, for me, that would be the dream, is that innovation becomes a really high priority from government down, from policy down, the re-education of the workforce and the reskilling to prepare them for the future. So we don't have so many people who are studying hospitality and tourism or industries you're paid by the hour. We need high value people thinking about creating value. And to your point, there are a number of really large global players entering this market. They see the potential here. They see that we've got sort of all the pieces to make great success, but they're not local businesses. And so, I would love to see that, but the problem I think we still have is we don't value this idea of learning. We have the lowest participation in professional development in the OECD. On average, if you look at the Education Council website, which is a government website, talks about numbers, just 2% of men and 4% of women over 40 study anything in any given year. Like, it's a very, very low number of people who are actively out there doing things. So I think if we shift that and we commit more into learning and innovation and experimentation, and we look at the likes of what Callaghan Innovation are doing to kind of look at research and development and nurturing and supporting growth, and then we could be a very different and a very kind of the future of our economy could be completely changed, and that would include supporting Māori and Pacific businesses and the economy. But right now we need to actually understand the value we're not pushing enough around innovation and creativity that we need to take on some of these international players.
100% right. Thanks, Frances. It's been great to chat. Now, those that are interested in the book, Future You, that's out there everywhere.
It's out there.
You
can
get your hands on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep, excellent. And where do they get in touch if they, are interested in folks interested in furthering their education or connecting with you in some way?
Sure. So we have two different institutes. Tech Futures Lab, typically more for people who work in for-profit businesses, so corporate large businesses. The Mind Lab, people who work more in things like social development, education, and health. Both available under the Tech Futures Lab or Mind Lab online. If you want to reach out to me, I'm on LinkedIn. Strange spelling, Frances with an E, Valentine with an I, Valintine. Love to hear from you. And if you do manage to read the book, and love your feedback, good or bad, it's always good to know what people are thinking in the market.
Great. Well, thanks very much for joining us, and thanks everybody for listening in to the New Zealand Tech Podcast this week. Big thank you to our show partners who make NZ Tech Podcast possible, and for their support of the technology and innovation ecosystems here in New Zealand. So thanks to Gorilla Technology, Vodafone, Vocus, HP and Spark. All right, catch you next week. Cheers.
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.